most of you know me, those of you who don't. My name is Uriah Burke. I'm a PhD student here in the philosophy department, and my topic is how should BFO classify films? I'm going to be taking a pretty coarse-grained look at this, so hopefully it's not too generalized and we don't get bored of the general topics. So here's my agenda, if you will, rather than outline. So I want to talk about my motivations for the project. I want to talk about the basic understanding of film. I'm going to avoid necessary and sufficient conditions. I know that's analytic philosophy heresy, but I just want to talk about what I'm the phenomenon I'm pointing at when I'm thinking about film, because I think it's going to drastically change as we go. I'm going to talk about why/how Smith misclassifies film in BFO. So that's my punchy argument there. Dr. Smith is wrong about films. I'm going to talk about some ontological issues that come out of his classification. I'm going to talk about some legal implications for copyrights that come out of the classification. I'm going to try and fix the problem with my own reclassification, and then there's going to be other ontological/legal complications that come out of that, specifically for copyrights. So let's move right along. So if you start studying like ontology of art, specifically ontology of film, it ends up being extraordinarily phenomenologically oriented. So those of you who aren't familiar with continental philosophy, this is the type of French stuff that Dr. Smith rails against. And kind of the key point that you want to keep in mind is that it grounds ontology of objects and experience, right? So we understand what the film is, or the art piece is, in our experience of that film or art piece. This is useful in some contexts. I'm going to make that other heretical statement as well. The biggest useful context is going to be like art criticism. Okay, so when we're criticizing what a piece of art is, or whether it's useful or good or anything like that, our experience plays a huge role in that. And I think some of the ontological issues of experience might play a role in that as well. It's not useful for many legal discussions. While I was writing that, I was thinking about it. It might be useful in some legal context, maybe about censorship. So if an art piece is particularly not aesthetically valuable, then it might be worth censoring or something like that. But that's the only legal context I could think of. The big one that I'm concerned with is copyright, right? And so I don't know that experience of a film, understanding the film in terms of experience, can tell me who owns that film. I have here The Dark Knight. Whether or not how the object made us feel seems to tell me very little about who owns the film, who has rights to the film, what's going on with the film's status legally in copyright. So I think BFO is a good alternative, right? It's a good analytic ontology, and its classifications should help us inform how we understand the legal status, the copyright status of films in this particular case. Maybe other art pieces, but I'm looking at films in particular, right? So things I'm concerned with: who owns or has rights to an object, whether the object even can be owned, things like that. And so these are sort of broader range questions that I think come out of BFO, right? Can we own a role, for example? That's a pretty fundamental type of ontological category. Can generally dependent continuants be owned? That's a little nod to later. I think they can, and I think they should. So let's talk about the basics of what film is. So film is a human artifact. It's one of the major markers of film, I think. It's predominantly a visual medium, right? So it sometimes has auditory stimulation, but generally speaking, film is mostly visual, right? And it comes out of the use of the phi phenomenon, which you see an example of here in this nifty little gift. Basically, what ends up happening is you have frames of pictures, right? Very similar pictures. And then you line them up together and you rapidly show them. And if you show them quick enough, it appears to us like the object is moving, or thing is moving, the picture is moving. Right? So effectively, we get motion out of the successive frames. Right? So I want to make a note here. That, as I said before, I'm not going to necessarily go for necessary and sufficient conditions as much. I left this intentionally vague because I don't want to declassify many things that we like to think of as films. I want this to be useful for our everyday language. Some examples: short films. So I don't want to put a length on it. Films with minimal editing. I think that somebody could potentially shoot with their camera on their phone, and it could end up being a film, even if they don't like cut it and chop it and all that kind of stuff. And there's, of course, films without sound, so the auditory stimulation isn't necessary, right? So, and I also don't want to make any assumptions about the medium, right? So some people like to use film and reserve it for like actual film strips. I don't mean that. Anything that's dealing with sort of pictures in motion will be good enough for me. Incidentally, this might make GIFs films for me, so that might be a problem. But I don't think it's that big a deal, personally. So this is the U.S. copyright law definition of motion. I believe 1976 is the last time it was updated. Certainly in the 70s, or of motion picture. I'm using this because this is the closest thing to my ongoing commentary of what film is that they have. I think it's pretty dang close, right? I think you could probably substitute motion picture with film here. For the most part, they use audio-visual works. If you look at the notion of audio-visual works, it's almost a direct rehash of motion picture here, which is interesting. The biggest difference is that it uses accompanying sounds in the definition, but says that they're not necessary, which is an interesting sort of legal term that I think they felt they needed to include. So again, essentially the same concept that I'm after. I'm looking for sort of I guess you could say a cluster concept, but that might be a little bit on the technical sense. So here are some prime examples, right? These are commonly known films, right? We have The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan, and we have Citizen Kane, okay? Great films. I highly recommend them. Watch them if you can, right? So what is the BFO classification of film? Or is it a continuant or an occurrent? That's the big question I'm after. And I think there's some subdivisions that we could talk about. But the sort of big question that I'm after is continuant or occurrent. So this is pretty familiar. I hijacked some of Dr. Smith's stuff and then re-edited it together to lay out the different options that I'm seeing in this situation. So again, we have continuants and occurrents. The big issue here is processes and events and realizations. And with continuants, we have generically dependent continuants, information ending sequences, dependent continuants, quality roles, and then independent continuants things, or standard options. Right? Hopefully this should all be familiar. If not, then I don't know what we're doing this morning. So this is another slide that I partially hijacked from Dr. Smith. This is literally like a screenshot of his slide. And this is where I understand him to be defining film, or more accurately, classifying film. So you can ignore most of it. The big thing here is film script and film, right? So a film script is an executable entity, and a film is actually an execution for Dr. Smith, right? Now, what kind of context is he talking about? I cite him in Lecture 7. Well, here's another screenshot of his slide.
Just to anticipate, I was wrong then.
Yes, you're wrong. So, the portion of the slides he's trying to help classify what various computer programs are. So he's looking at them as executable entities and then executions, etc. And he's comparing them to things like literary works, right, which I think are the prime best example of an analog to film. So he looks at these marks of literary works, right? These are common aspects of literary works that help him classify what a literary work is. Right? So we have things like it is created, it's not abstract, right? It can have copies, but is not identical with any copy. So a copy counts as a copy, right? It is ordered or written sequence, an ordered written sequence, creates a pattern, can be read. This is the execution, right? Readings unfold in real time. The events represented unfold in represented time. Some readings may be better, more faithful than others, etc.
This is from an old set of slides, right?
Well, this was from your Lecture 7. I don't remember how old you said they were.
So, but was this lecture 7 in this class?
Yes,
Oh, I see.
I got them from the website.
It looks old to me, but maybe I borrowed it.
Okay, so what does this mean? Smith is maintaining that film is an execution of a film script, like a reading is an execution of a literary work, right? So performances are realizations, right? I.e. processes or events. Thus, films are processes of events for Smith, right? Executions are these processes that happen after the various instructions are followed for these events, right? So further, for Smith, films cannot be continuants, right? They can't be these individual things, like literary works, which are not identical to their readings. So, on first blush, this actually seems really plausible, okay, especially with the markers of film that we've already talked about, right? So, films would be processes on this. I think that's the most intuitive read of how to go about this, if they are occurrents. Processes are dependent on. That should be occurrent. I should have put continuance there. My apologies. That was a mistake. They're dependent on continuance, right? So it would seem like we have multiple pictures. Those could be the continuants, right? And the processes unfold over time. So we have rapidly maneuvering pictures over time, and those pictures create a process which the film would be. That seems pretty plausible, right? It seems very similar to a musical production, right? Or playing from a musical work. So here are some of the ontological problems with films as occurrents, right? So every screening of a particular film, or every screening would be a particular film, right? So what do we mean by what do we mean when we say when we talk about a film like The Dark Knight, right? Usually we're talking about something more universal. We're talking about the film in general. But if this is correct, then all the particular screenings are the only films going on, right? So there's an issue of universality here, right? So this also brings in some issues of the way our copyright law is written. This is less an issue with Dr. Smith, and I think as a recurring theme will happen, our copyright law is just badly written. You know, being in the 70s, it's just terrible. The biggest issue here is citation B for what the subject matter of copyright laws are. I've highlighted the big issue here. It explicitly denies processes, right? So you can't have a process, and then it gives a terrible definition of a process in its descriptions, where a process is one known or later developed. I have very little clue what that means. Perhaps it's because I'm not a lawyer, and I note that that's a bad definition. In looking up some sort of descriptions about this, it usually describes processes like methods for going about things or something like that. So the prime example that I found in some of the literature was that you can't copyright the Dewey Decimal System. So that seems like a terrible understanding of process to me, and I think that we could fix the definition of process, and it would work better. So the tricky conclusion, right, that comes from this is that films they're explicitly stated as motion pictures to be copyrightable, yet if they're processes, they're prohibited from being copyrightable. So if we fix the definition of process in the legal code, this could work. So it's not that big of an issue for Dr. Smith's take. I think the deeper ontological issue that I pointed to becomes much more widely spread when we consider it in terms of legality. So let's say that The Dark Knight is identified with individual screenings, because it's a process, right? The copyright would then only apply to some individual screenings, not others, because you can't own all of them, presumably, you're just not quick enough. This is partially why we tend to talk in universals, right? When we copyright things, we copyright them as universal entities. So, our other classification options for BFO. These are what I have listed: independent continuant, dependent continuant, and generically dependent continuant. So, independent continuant, I don't think this will work, because it suffers from the exact same individuation issues as the processes do, right? Because if the film is identified as individual copies of the film or individual screening events or what have you, we get the same sort of universality issues because independent continuants are particular objects. Dependent continuants are pretty interesting. I had to think about how this would unfold. We think about dependent continuants as qualities or roles. So I started thinking about, could the Dark Knight be a quality of a dependent continuant, possibly something like disposition or something like that. I think this could still arise because we'd end up with particular qualities related to individual continuants, right? We'd have to comment that the Dark Knight was some sort of universal dependent continuance, and that might work, but I'm not positive that it would. So it just seems odd to put it in the same class as things that are red or the role boss, right? So I think generically dependent continuants are just the right fit. Some Goldilocks. Yes. I get the thumbs up. He's already revised his view. I win. Okay. So they are dependent bearers on copies, right? But they're not particular individual bearers, right? Thus allows universality of the entity. If all copies are gone, then it's gone. That's going to be kind of a big deal because it's going to be a little bit of a puzzle for me later. And it includes ordered sequences of patterns, and sequences of patterns can be enacted. So those are sort of the big markers I'm looking for. These are what I'm taking to be the marks of film that are analogous to the marks of a work of literature that's driving forth my case for it being a generically dependent continuant. It's created, it's non-platonic, can be copied, should not be seen as identical to any one copy. If we had 2 DVDs of The Dark Knight, it's not one of those DVDs, it's more abstract than that. It can be screened, right? So I'm using the term screening here as the process event that's going on when we show the movie, right? And then some screenings are closer to the original or the more universal object. You can have bad sound, you could have flickering lights, you could have any number of situations that it's bad. So, first conclusion, films are like literary works, generally dependent continuants. This makes them a sequence or a pattern, and possibly information entities, artifacts. Considering my understanding is information entities and artifacts can contain or be made up of sequences of patterns. I'm going to go with the latter. And perhaps the best way to classify an information artifact, as I mentioned. So, this is one of the ontological puzzles that I came up with as I was trying to sort of sort through all of this and point to what the film is and things like that. So here's the question that came up as I was trying to think through this. What instantiates the film, right? First blush is screenings, but that doesn't work, right? Because they're processes, and processes have the problems we've already talked about. So the media copy was the next thing, the actual DVD, and I thought I had it there, but when I started thinking about the various media copies, they seemed much more like a set of instructions for display, right? So a DVD has coding on it, right? And that coding only works in a particular machine, and that outputs particular images in certain sequences. The images aren't themselves in the DVD, if you will, right? Maybe on film strips, might debate that one. They still seem like pretty close to instructions because they're not really the images that we associate with the movie itself. They're usually like off color. They need to be projected. They need to have projection through them in order for the movie to really count. And they're also not moving, right? Film script, that's another problem because it would be really weird to say that the film is instantiated in the film script. How can words instantiate patterns of pictures? Especially considering that so many movies are drastically different than their scripts end up being, or than their official scripts, right? Rewrites happen, things change. As a set of instructions to make a film, they're pretty interesting, but I don't know that they instantiate the film. So I'm not positive if any of these quite work. My tentative solution is that film could be instantiated in the same independent continuance pictures that the screening process is instantiated in. So when screenings are going on, they have like so, have pictures on the screen, and that would instantiate whatever the film picture is lording over as a universal. This raises the question, because generically dependent continuants cease to exist when there are nothing to instantiate them. What happens when there's no screenings being played? Right? So possibly there's been movies out there that have been lost to time. There's still maybe physical copies of them, but they've not been played in 30, 40 years or something like that, right? They're in a vault, like Prince's vault. Do they cease to exist as movies? That seems unintuitive. My only sort of saving grace for this is that maybe they're like a fist. If nobody's making a fist at any one time, they don't cease to be. But if there's suddenly no more people to ever make a fist or something like that, maybe it won't work, right? So there's also a legal issue that comes up. I'm not beyond my own sort of recognition of how terrible copyright law is as it applies to my own ontological classifications. So this is the same definition, but I've emphasized the word idea, right? Because it is pretty vague. It's not really well defined in the. In fact, it's never actually defined in the actual copyright law, despite it being one of the major driving forces of understanding copyright law. And patterns are never directly discussed in copyright law as their own thing. They are discussed in relation to repeat offenders. So if you display a pattern of repeat offense, that's worse for you. They never define what a pattern is at that point. And I think that's fairly obvious that it's nowhere close to the types of patterns we're talking about. So, this is Judge Learned Hand, okay? We're going to precedent here, and we're talking about cases in the past. Figure out what ideas are, maybe a little bit, at least in legal sense, what patterns are. Because they do show up in case studies, in precedent. Learned Hand, again, I can't make up his name, I wish I could. In Nicholas versus Universal Pictures Corp., created what he calls the pattern test. And it's actually the famous test for determining if things like plots are copyright infringing, right? So he says that their patterns of increasing generality can be applied to a story and technically fit, right? So you can generally describe a story and then make a more general description of a story, and so on and so forth. And eventually, one such abstraction cannot apply, right? What does that mean? It can't be copyrightable, right? So you have certain definitions and abstractions of the story that are copyrightable, and other abstractions that are not. And that is because otherwise the playwright could prevent the use of his idea, to which, apart from their expression, his property is never extended. Nobody has ever been able to fix that boundary, and nobody ever can. Right. So this is a fancy way, or a relatively fancy way of saying that if you have a story about two children who get lost, you cannot be sued for copyright infringement on Hansel and Gretel, because two children getting lost is very, very general, right? But what does this end up meaning for my discussion of patterns? Patterns are abstractions used to measure a desire. That's a possibility in this legal sense. But it keeps patterns in the gray area, right? So putting in the precedent, we can still have patterns in the gray area. Patterns might be ideas, right? Because they're part of the measurement here. If patterns are ideas, then they're not copyrightable. Because remember, the ideas are explicitly denied as copyrightable under a copyright law. So then we get to the same sort of problem that I pointed out in copyright issues with the process definition, whereby copyrights are explicitly whereby films are explicitly copyrightable and then denied under a classification. So again, this could be solved with a classification of pattern inside the law. So final conclusion: regardless of whether they're classified as processes or generally or occurrence, the law needs to be changed. Just no matter what, it needs to fit our ontology, because our ontology is great. Well, no, it needs to be more rigorously applied and defined, preferably with an eye to metaphysics and ontology. I still favor the generally dependent continuant as a proper classification, mostly for the universality issue. And that's it. Thank you.
So I want to make two important points. First of all, phenomenology became French,
Okay.
but the very early phenomenologists, particularly Husserl, who wrote a work called Logical Investigations, in which the term formal ontology was first used, that they were still very good. And the basic formal ontology is actually inspired by Husserl and by the work of one of his greatest students, who was Polish, a man called Roman Ingarden, who was an expert on the ontology of art and wrote a book including a long treatment of the ontology of film, which you should look at. Now, the second point I wanted to make relates to slide 26. Can you go back to 26?
Sure.
26.
Oh, sorry.
So, if the film is a generically dependent continuum, which I think is correct,
Sure.
then it doesn't have instantiations because generically dependent continuants are themselves instances.
Okay.
There is just one The Dark Knight. There is just one
Okay.
Third Man, and so on. What they get is concretizations.
Okay.
And like a literary work, a film can be concretized in somebody's head when they watch it or read it. But the main way in which films are concretized is by being screened.
Sure.
So what instantiates a film is a screening.
Okay.
Which is a process, right? Like all concretizations of films. So that's why it's tempting to think of a film as a process, because all its concretizations are processes.
Okay.
Now, I think that's all I wanted to say. So, someone else want to have a question?
And so something else you may think about is
Sure.
analogous to this is the staging of a play. That's
Right.
Right. It could be the script could be similarly concretized in some book around it, but the actual play itself is actually concretized in the playing out of it, which is a whole set of processes. And similarly for like the reading of a poem, something which is can be read multiple times and can be concretized in particular readings. I think of these as analogous to particular screenings of the document.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anyone?